All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at Packback. We are super excited to walk you through this webinar about empathy versus the internet, 5 themes for more human online classes. Before we get started with introducing ourselves, I just want to take care of a couple of logistics. So in case if you do have any questions at all, we do have an attendee chat room, so please feel free to drop any questions or any comments in there. And then my colleague Ariam will be in the chat monitoring for questions. Additionally, if you want to ask something directly to us as the presenters, there's also a button at the top. It's like a little text box with a question mark in it where you can send any questions directly to the presenters as well. So we are super excited to have you here this morning. And I definitely want to take a moment to introduce my co-presenter here, Dr. Carol Higham from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So I will give her a second to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Carol Higham. I teach large sections of American history and small writing seminars. I've taught at 4 universities, 3 of which I've won teaching awards at, and I've also taught through the Texas A&M bonfire, the September 11th, couple of hurricanes, couple of tornadoes, and now COVID. So my fun fact is we got a kitten when we went into quarantine, because why not? And I really hope that my students leave with an understanding of how they learn and who they are, and maybe a little American history along the way.
Yep. And then to introduce myself real quick, my name is Ishani. I'm an experience manager here at Packback. So I work with professors from all across the country, making sure that they're able to really get the most out of their online discussion. But today, my role is to be Carol's co-presenter and help moderate this awesome discussion that we're about to have. But I'm going to hand it off to Carol to get us started.
So I think it's fair to say that this grew out of a conversation I had with Packback and Ariam, who's doing the chat, about my concerns about online learning versus remote learning versus active learning. So after the first week of going to remote learning, I found that it was very frustrating, and I was very concerned about my students, not just what they were learning, but how they were learning and whether I was meeting their needs. And I had this revelation that online learning is when you plan to teach through the computer and realize that you're using passive technology. Remote learning is when you're away from your students and they're away from you and they're trying to learn. And active learning is when students get to practice and try things and explore stuff and use their brains. And those three things aren't always the same. They're not mutually exclusive, but they don't always work together. And I saw active learning sort of disappear out of my remote learning through the online learning platforms. And so I was concerned about that, and spoke with Ariam about it. And then she called me back and we talked for over an hour about some things that were occurring. I also would like to say that I have a unique experience because I have a college student, a junior in college, and a sophomore in high school who are also trying to do this from home. So I've seen it from both sides, for better and for worse. And I have to say I've stolen some things from their teachers to do a better job. So um, everybody's very focused on outcome, and making sure students have the best outcomes. Some of my colleagues have felt like we don't shouldn't change the outcomes. Some of my colleagues have felt like you have to change the outcomes. I'm somewhere in between on that because there's only so much you can do. The assignments I created were created based on face to face. I rejiggered some stuff and redid some things to make it easier for students to achieve those issues, but I'm learning as I'm grading final papers right now that there are holes that I'm going to have to plug if I'm online again. So we at my university we had a weekend to plan, as I know a lot of people did, and that was clearly not enough to sort of plug the holes. And to be honest, I didn't know what the holes were going to be, and I still am not completely sure how some things fell into holes. So I'm going to have to figure that out. So remote education is really tough because the students are taken away from a lot of their regular resources. You can put those resources online as much as you want, but they're not going to reach out to them. It's one thing to drift into the library and ask a librarian a question. It's another thing to consciously email them. And so that's one of the holes I'm going to have to plug. Online learning can make things more accessible, and it can provide students with more platforms and ways to get to information. It can also highlight the inequities of learning, everything from lack of internet to slower computers, et cetera, et cetera. But it does provide the students a way to work at their own pace, which is something that people bring up a lot. One of my son's students says, "Oh, this is great. You can work at your own pace," until that pace falls behind the deadlines, and then it's not such a good thing. So, but there's also a way I'm discovering different ways to interact with students through online platforms that can maybe do a better job of helping them. And one of the most interesting articles I read was on using the tools from disability services to make an online platform as accessible to students as possible, presenting things in multiple ways so that different students can access it in the best way. And I may circle back to that later. So, um, the cooperative learning groups is important, and I still haven't figured out a way to get students to do that. One of the first things I learned is that students think they're good at texting and interacting with each other electronically, and then they discovered they actually don't really communicate that much. They say things like, "What's up? When's lunch? What you got?" But they don't know how to express big ideas or work on projects together. So that trying to embrace the cooperative nature is going to be more difficult. I was very lucky. My students wrote a really good review of a cooperative project that they had to do online. So I have some good insight from them about what worked and what didn't. So, and Ishani, I've lost track of the slides. Are we at your slide yet? We have one more. Ah, there we go. So, online instruction went really quickly. And again, online and remote are not the same thing. I feel like I'm using online tools to do remote learning, and they're not necessarily the same thing. Keeping the students engaged and motivated has been a challenge. I did not use synchronous classes at first. I went to synchronous classes, which weren't really classes, but sort of therapy sessions. And I was shocked when I had 90% of my students show up for almost every single one of them. When I opened up time for students to Google Hangout with me, I had about 50% of the class took me up on that at some point. So making sure that students feel engaged without feeling like they're burdened and tied to the computer all the time. And that's one of the tensions with remote learning and online learning. Um, we keep thinking over and over and over again, oh, it gives them all this freedom, and then we expect them to sit in front of a computer all the time by themselves. And that's the other difference between remote learning and online learning. I've come to realize if you choose to do online learning, you may be thinking, okay, I'll do it by myself at these times. But if you are in remote learning when you're planning on face to face, you're used to having colleagues around you, students around you who can interact. And the number one thing students tell me is they miss hearing from other students that they're confused or they're frustrated with an assignment. They feel like they're the only one, they're the only one not getting it. They feel completely isolated. So that this makes it very hard.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
All right. So, moving into the portion that's really the most engaging, it's going to be a bunch of questions and answers. One of the things that we found through both speaking with Carol and also with some outside research that we've done, looking at both like scholarship, but also what are professors talking about on Twitter or Reddit or other social medias, is that bridging the gap between online learning, remote learning, and active learning really has to come through empathy. And what Carol is saying here about really like using her class time as a space for students to grumble a little bit about what's going on or opening this opportunity for students to have that one-on-one conversation is really a way to show students that you still care and bringing value to this crazy remote learning period that we're in right now. So we're going to break this down by theme. And the first one that we really found in our research is that imposter syndrome is not just for students. So we've all heard of imposter syndrome, which is the idea that you're not quite cut out and that you were chosen by accident for whether it's getting into college, whether it's the profession that you're in, whatever it may be. Um, and the hurried transition to online has led a lot of professors to feel like they're letting their students down, or even feeling like, gosh, academia maybe was the wrong choice for me. But just because something is different and just because you've had to make an adjustment in your class doesn't necessarily mean that you've made a full on mistake. So I'm curious then, Carol, how do you feel your teaching style has changed due to the rapid transition to online? And then along with that, what do you miss the most about this face to face instruction?
So I'm going to start with the second part first because that influences the first part. The thing I miss the most is the facial expression, nonverbal contact, and then the outside of the classroom contact with students, which is where I often find out what's working and what's not working. So, for instance, when I lecture, and I was very lucky, I'll be open, I had 3 research classes that were working on projects when we went online. So I've not had to lecture or do remote lecturing. But I miss watching in class when I start talking about something. I usually pick out 2 or 3 students that I think of as canaries, and I watch their facial expressions or whether they put their pen down to know whether I'm being clear or not. And then I'll ask them, did I lose you? That's gone. That is gone. And especially with the delay in Zoom or Google Hangout, it can't I can't keep up with whether they're paying attention or not. So that has changed it to me trying to do live chat while doing Google Hangout, which has helped. Sometimes if I post any questions, even as I'm talking, students are more likely to put questions up. And it's interesting, they are most likely to not post it to the group, but to me directly. So it's like they're more embarrassed to ask questions online than they were in class, which is frustrating. I've tried to create as many different platforms for them to ask questions, for me to ask them questions. And one thing I've learned when I have a hangout with the class as a whole is to give them time to talk about what's frustrating them in other classes, and then they'll transition into what questions or frustrations they have with our class. When I ask them straight up, what don't you understand about this assignment or what we were doing, they're very quiet. But if I say, what's frustrating you in your other classes, they warm up and then they'll apply it back and give me feedback. So those are my biggest frustrations.
Awesome. Yeah, great answer. And I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about your teaching style in particular is how much you do look for that feedback from your students. And I think that really ties into this whole theme of empathy being important in that you're really like valuing their opinion of the class and using them as like a gauge of what's really going on in terms of are they getting the material or not. Um, so yeah, along with that then, if you could change one thing about this particular transition to online, what would it be?
I would have liked to have had a week where we were doing hybrid, so I would have been more aware earlier of what some of the problems were going to be. So I thought I knew what some of the problems were going to be. I was right on some of them, but on other ones, I sort of had to. I spent the first 2 weeks scrambling, trying to figure out how to resolve things, how to make sure people stayed engaged, how to help people, learning the technology, which wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But if I could change one thing, I would have liked a week of hybrid so I could sort
Mhm,
of get an idea instead of just abrupt, okay, Tuesday, you're online.
mhm.
So
Yeah, totally makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting, giving kind of like a transitionary period where people are, your students will still be on campus and they can potentially still go to your office hours and ask for that in-person help, but they're starting to do their coursework online. I think that's a really good idea, and I think something that school should consider if this slash when this does happen again. So, yeah, really good answer there.
thank you.
Yeah. All right. Then moving on to theme two. One of the other things that's come up frequently is that the lack of expertise in the existing literature on online teaching can be frustrating. So, the resources that are available for instructors making the transition to online instruction don't often cover the most important aspects of creating a truly engaging learning environment. So, right now, a lot of the body of literature on online teaching is very logistics based. So, like, how do you move a test assignment online or how do you move lectures online, but it doesn't necessarily look at how to cultivate really active learning environments online. So I'm curious then, what do you feel has been the most useful resource for you in learning how to make that successful online transition?
So my most useful resource has been my colleagues. So there have been a bunch of us who've just ping pong texts and emails, and I couldn't get my students to do this, and how do we do that, and do you know how to make this work? And that's been the most useful, especially with some tricks about Google Hangouts versus Zoom. And the second most useful one is students. I've had students email me and say, "Hey, a professor in my class did this." One of my students said to me, "We did presentations in a class on Zoom, and it didn't stick as much as Google Hangouts." Another student told me about a student who just had a faculty member who just had Canvas chat open during regular class period when they were working on a project and anyone could write in. And that turned out to be really useful because I discovered many more students were watching the chat than participating, but they saw the questions asked that they were thinking of asking. So those would be my two most useful because I found a lot of the literature was not very helpful, or very rah. This is perfect. This is great. I'm like, I need to know what I'm about to encounter. So
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting, especially bringing up like your students bringing in some of the tips and tricks that they're seeing from other professors. Um, I think like one of the things that's really come up out of this transitionary period that we're in right now is how deep and influential these networks can be of just that like basically like colleague to colleague, peer to peer, peer to professor, student to professor, how deeply entrenched that network is. And I think that taking that feedback from students again, really leaning into like, hey, maybe my students might have an idea that I don't necessarily have right now, and giving them that room to feel comfortable to share these tricks from other professors, I think is really amazing. Um,
can
yeah,
I
and
add?
then
Can I
hmm?
add something to that? So
Yeah, go ahead.
I had two students. They went back and forth on Slack versus Discord for discussions, and two students kept raising those. And so I put it out to the students. If any of you use Slack, Discord, and I have a lot of IT students in one class, and one IT student gave me a pros and cons list for both, and then just said at the end, I don't think either of these are appropriate for teaching. I have some faculty who are using them, but I don't think they're appropriate for teaching. So I decided not to go with either of those or try to learn a new technology if this student who is an IT person was concerned about it. So that I found that it was helpful that students were willing to, when I put out the word, they're like, oh, try this, or have you thought of that? Because they are more tech savvy in some ways than we are. Not always, though, I found. So so
Mhm.
someone wants to know how Slack was being used exactly. So apparently some faculty have used Slack for live discussions while they go through PowerPoints. Again, I did not choose to use Slack. But so that's what a student said to me because I did a few PowerPoints, but not many, and talked over them and let students post questions and stuff. And so they had said they used Slack. And then this IT student was concerned about Slack's not as secure. People can create side comment. He just felt it was not really built for this, and so probably would have more problems. So I appreciated that. My husband uses Slack at work all the time, but they seem to use it just to figure out who's going to lunch and things like that. So again, I'm not sure what the technology would work as.
Yeah. Um, that's really interesting. I've never heard of Slack being used for live discussion, so we use Slack at Packback. So, but also to figure out who's going to lunch and also make sure all logistics are in place. But yeah, I think that's really interesting that professors have found and like adapted these tools that weren't necessarily made for education, because like they're the literature isn't there of like what is the best practice to have live discussions while like doing a PowerPoint, or um, what is like the best tool for each different aspect that you usually have in the face-to-face classroom. So I think it's like interesting that students are like giving their own suggestions, and then professors are also going out trying to find this tech to basically fill all these gaps. So kind of like going along with that, if slash when this emergency teaching situation happens again, what types of resources do you think you would like to see available?
So and then we'll get to the question there. Uh, I think. Hmm, so I've thought about this on and off. I mean, I'd like to see more resources like Packback that allow for discussion and live discussion and sorting of discussions. In the fall, I'll teach a 110-person class, and it was hard managing two 35-person classes with lots of discussion and wheels going on. I'd also like to see more platforms that have more interactive instead of passive learning. I mean, I use Canvas to call them out, and everything's about posting things and getting things. Graded and grading systems and rubrics, but not space for students. I just sort of force space for students to try things, to put up different ways. I'd also love to see something where peer review students can actually interact with each other, either through live chat or through voice so that they can discuss the peer reviews instead of just passively posting comments on somebody's paper and then that person
Mm,
passively looking at it. That's one of my biggest complaints. There aren't ways for the students on the side to interact and exchange ideas and help each other. It's all very passive and posting and rubric oriented. And that I think the most important act of learning is stumbling around in the dark and, discovering, oh, it's really not dark in this corner, and that person understands that corner, and that it's very hard to do that in online platforms right now.
mhm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So one of the questions that's come in, some students might wonder what the point of taking online classes is if they can watch YouTube videos, read a book, and use the internet on their own without paying for a class. So what are your thoughts on this?
so there have always been students who do that and don't take a class, and history is full of students who come in as experts on one topic because they've watched the History Channel on YouTube and read all the books on it. So that's always been a thing in education, and I actually applaud that. If a student figures out that they can do that, then I encourage them to. But there are lots of topics where they need guidance. And I'm going to quote my dear daughter over her macroeconomics class, where she said, if I wanted to teach myself at macroeconomics, I would have done it. But I don't. I want someone else to teach me macroeconomics. Sorry, there's a cat. I thought it was a person. Uh, so, so I think there are lots and lots of subjects where students either want to go more in depth or it's technical and they need help doing it. The problem is a lot of online stuff might as well just be a list of YouTube videos and readings. We have to make it value added with, again, room for students to explore ideas and techniques and have the time to work through things instead of just it's right, it's wrong, and on you go, because then they are going to migrate away and try to figure out another way to do it.
Mhm.
So I think that's an excellent question.
Great. All right, so kind of going along with that, wow, these are really flowing together. Um, Theme three is that peer to peer learning often doesn't have a clear place in online learning environments. So, kind of like exactly what Carol was saying, how do we get students beyond just a list of YouTube videos and readings and just like making almost like passive comments on the material that they're absorbing? So, a large component of creating effective teaching outcomes comes from the in-person interaction that students have in the classroom on a daily basis. So ensuring that that transference of skills from student to student still happens, regardless of environment, requires a very clear plan of action for students and instructors. So, how are you ensuring that students are able to learn best practices for being an online student in these entirely remote settings?
So here's my big fear for the fall if we were to go straight online. Because we went middle of the semester, I do a lot of things to make them learn each other's names and develop relationships within their classes. And that makes it easier. That made it easier to go online. But then they got shy. They wouldn't, when they did peer, they were doing a group project when we moved online. And I said, if you're not comfortable exchanging email, phone numbers, then exchange emails, do a live chat through our Canvas chat or something so you can talk about it. And then I heard in their group assessments that a lot of them felt like they weren't good at doing that. So, trying to get them to engage on a many different platforms, texting, et cetera, would be the best. I have sent out weekly notices of this is the plan for the week. Here are things you might consider to make it easier to do this. And I also, after reading the article on using disability services, I tried to make sure things were accessible from 2 or 3 different points within our LMS so that students weren't stumbling around trying to find things, because that's actually what's happened with my son's school. Some people have put things so it shows up on the calendar. Some people send out announcements. Some people send out Outlook messages. Some people send out Canvas messages. Every morning he has to check 4 different places to see what's going on for that day. And that frustrates students to no end. So I tried to make mine as accessible and give them a checklist for every week. This is what you need to do. This is why you need to do it. This is when the deadline is going to be, so that they could keep track of what's going on, because I found it overwhelming. I was late to class one morning because I didn't have to commute anymore, and so I kind of was chatting with my husband at breakfast and realized, oh, I'm supposed to be in class right now. So it's hard to keep track of the days of the week and everything. I had a student write me and say, I missed the assignment. I'm really sorry. And I wrote back and said, it's Wednesday. The assignment's due Thursday. And she wrote back and she said, I just don't know what day of the week it is. So it's a hard transition. And so I tried to give them as many signposts as possible so they knew what was going on, and tried to be another thing I tried to do is be very regular. If I said I was sending out a message every Thursday night, I sent it out every Thursday night so they wouldn't feel like it was lost. So I see we have some more questions.
Oh, it's just a comment. Every day is
Okay.
Wednesday.
Yeah. In my house, every day is Monday. We never get to Wednesday. It's always Monday.
Yeah, I think especially one of the things that you were saying there about like the regularity and making sure that your students have a checklist of what to do. I think, giving them a nice agenda, giving them really clear expectations of what you expect from them is really important in terms of keeping students organized in what's arguably like the most disorganized period that at least I've lived through. So I think like especially making sure that your expectations are clear and that students have a really clear understanding of what is expected from them every week is a great way to like ensure that students are keeping on top of the work and learning those best practices of building their own schedule, et cetera, et cetera.
And I've worked really hard to turn things around faster than usual so that they have immediate feedback. And part of that is they kind of expect it because it's online, but I wanted to make sure that they had immediate feedback because I also realized I do a lot of, someone turns in something it's not quite what I was expecting, there's some problems with it, and I grab them after class or before class and say, were you confused by the assignment? I saw this, I don't have that. So I really tried to turn things around quickly with lots of feedback, and wrote students, here's my Google Hangout times you might want to talk to me because I think there's some issue, and everybody I did that with took me up on it. So I just tried to make myself as accessible as possible.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And then the second theme that I was finding underneath theme three was that with libraries now being closed, obviously because students aren't on campus, and also some students are not necessarily the most familiar with looking for sources. I felt like as a history professor, you might be able to speak to this, but what happens to students in a remote setting who are not familiar with how to conduct their own research or how to find sources? Do you have any like best practices of encouraging this for students who might not be familiar with the process?
So two of my three classes were non-majors, and they're doing a research proposal. So I had a lot of questions on this. So I don't know if this is the best practice, but what I did was make myself as available as possible. If you don't know where to find something, let me know. I'll help you find it. If you don't know whether this resource qualifies as an online resource or not, shoot me this link and I'll let you know what it is. My students struggled a lot with the idea of web pages versus online resources. I limit them to one web page, but they can use as many online resources, book collections and articles and stuff. But they don't know the difference between those. And we usually go over it in class. And I did do a PowerPoint on it, but they were still very confused. So I spent a lot of time. As a matter of fact, right before this, I was answering questions from two students who sent me links, and I was like, okay, this is this type of resource. So trying to make it as interactive and making myself as available as possible. We had the problem, which is our library was open. It was open, then it was closed. And so students had requested interlibrary loans for my research methods class, or had been going to the library every day, and literally one morning it was just closed. And so I had to help some students twist their topics so they could use online resources, because the other problem is not everything's online, not even close. So
Mhm.
I just tried to make myself as available and helpful, and I group sourced stuff. I had a couple of people who had problems finding things, put out the word to other students before, because I figured our librarians were just covered up. And students were very good about saying, "Oh, I know this resource," or "I know there's a PDF version of the book." Or in one
Mhm.
case, the group project, one of my 12 groups had not followed my directions before spring break and made a copy of the chapter they're going to have to work on. And another group came to the rescue and said, "Oh, we did that. We took pictures of it by accident because we had the wrong chapter written down. So here's the PDF." So I tried to get. I mean, I was really proud of my class. I've been very proud of my class. They've done a lot of saving each other. I have 2 students who will have to do late presentations because they were both ill. One they thought had COVID but did not, and most of the classes volunteered to come to that late presentation, so they'll have an audience. Which I've seen numerous times where students have gone above and beyond and been kind to each other, and that really makes me proudest of my students, better than them getting everything in on time.
Mhm. So we have a couple questions. One is, did your students ask for help from librarians, and did you suggest this to them?
So I always suggest they get in touch with the librarians, but because I had 105 students, I don't want to stick them all on the librarians. I usually tell them to start with me. So because usually they're simple questions, and I also coach them on how to ask the librarians because I know librarians are wonderful people, but I don't like it when my students write them the night before and say, "Hey, I have a paper on the American West." I coach them in like, I have a paper on women in the West, and I'm looking for diaries by women from this region, and I'm not sure how to find them. Be as specific as possible. So I do encourage them to get in touch with the librarians. Our librarians were just overwhelmed because they got as little warning as we did. So I really try to manage. I can usually answer 80% of the questions, and then I forward on or encourage them to get in touch with the librarians after that point. Um, and especially for my 2 non-major classes, which are on cannibalism, um, I I put students in touch with each other who are doing similar topics, and that helped them find resources before we went to the librarian.
Mhm. Yeah, great answer there. And then we've got another question here. Do you usually give more slack to the students in the online classes than the traditional face-to-face ones? For example, are you more likely to extend the homework deadline for an online student than a face-to-face student, or are you treating them the same?
That's an excellent question because I don't know. Um, I have cut. I always have a rule that if I've misstated a deadline in class or put it up in the wrong place, whichever deadline is latest is the one that I hold the students to. So that has held true online and face to face. And I will say, because of extenuating circumstances, I have given some slack to some students who have deaths in the family and other issues, and I haven't waited to go through dean of students. I've just sort of given them slack as can be. Looking at my classes, I'd say there's slightly more than average who are in those types of positions with extensions or other things. But on the other hand, I do get complaints that I'm very hard about deadlines, that I don't allow late papers, so I set my portal so when it comes in or it doesn't, and then they have to email me if they want to turn it in late. And a lot of students complain about that. Whereas when it's physical, they can just slide it under my door and just hope I don't notice that it's late. So I'm just not sure. I don't have any metrics on that. My hunch is that I've been a little softer this semester because I know there have been lots of things going on. For instance, our university notified students a week ago that they had to clean out their dorm rooms during this last week of classes and finals, and everybody was assigned one day to do it. And I had students who were driving from the coast of North Carolina, which is 5 hours each way, to hit their window to clean out the dorm room and head back. So I have students who write me ahead of time. I've given some slack to. That's not a usual situation. And so, this is in the fall, though, I will have more bumpers and guardrails for those types of situations because it should be more manageable.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think along with that, this is definitely a very unusual semester. And I found that with the professors that I've been working with here at PackBack, um, since it's a very disorganized and chaotic time, it's also disorganized and chaotic on the professor side as well, as I've heard. Um, and so with that, it's really leading into that empathy again and realizing that your students are confused about your class, probably every other class that they're taking, and they're moving back in with their parents who they might not have seen since they've graduated high school, or they're going back to one computer that they're sharing with 5 siblings, or whatever it may be. It's They're trying to be productive in a time of true chaos. And I think that overall, I've seen a lot of just like leaning into that empathy and making sure that your students are first and foremost taking care of themselves and trying to like stay productive, keep that organization and that sense of normalcy as a way to really make it through a very, very chaotic time. Um, but yeah, I don't know if you have anything else that to share along with that thought.
Well, I've just the first 2 weeks were so chaotic from both ends. Our end, both my kids were in a holding pattern. Their schools just extended spring break, and then we're trying to figure things out. So again, that was a real help because my kids were just really anxious. They didn't know whether they were going back to school or whether they're going to keep school from here. My daughter left school for spring break with 5 days worth of clothes, and she has had to rotate that ever since because she's not been able to go back to her school and get anything. So my son is in school closer, and we had to make two different trips to go over. One to go get some stuff out of his room, and then 2 days later they told us, "Up, clean the room out. We're closing the dorms." So there was a lot of chaos, and I've tried to be
Mhm.
empathetic to that chaos. And I've had everything from a student call in to do his presentation from a McDonald's parking lot because his parents' Wi-Fi went down, and he was frantic because he'd had to drive across town and knew he was late. And then another student who went home, and his mother announced that he was going to have to live with his 12-year-old brother because he had twin 12-year-old brothers who don't get along. And so her idea was to split them and put the 21-year-old and the 12-year-old in the same room. So he was stressed about that issue. So, there are different things going on, and it's a weird time. And I try to be empathetic to students. And I've always found over the many years I've taught, the students that really have something going on contact you early. The students who don't contact you after the fact or after the deadline. I've had students write me 4 or 5 days before something and say, "Look, here's the situation," and I can always work with those students. So, and our dean of students office has just been overwhelmed, so I've just dealt with stuff as I can.
All right, so moving along with that, theme four is that empathy is acting as a coping mechanism for students and professors alike. So, exactly kind of what we were just talking about. In this unprecedented situation together, it's important to remain cognizant of your student situations and also on the flip side, be transparent with your students about the challenges that you might be facing as well. And exactly what Carol's been doing, both in her face to face class and in this online version. If you're comfortable, offer your students the ability to give input as well. So, what are some ways that you've been able to check in on your students?
So I've had everything from live chats to when I haven't heard from a student in a week, emailing them and seeing if everything's okay, to having them like do every week. I had an assignment that normally would have done face to face, and I would have just collected them and checked them off, but I turned those into graded assignments, complete or incomplete, just to keep an eye on who was participating and who wasn't. And that gave me a better idea of who's there, because that's another thing I miss about face to face. Oftentimes, if I don't see a student in class, I run into them on campus, and I've been known to follow students all the way to the library and be like, "Hi, I missed you in class the last week." So I miss having that ability to stalk my students. So I've tried to do it online as much as possible, and send them emails through different portals, and make myself as available as possible. Give them Google Hangout times. Respond to emails very, very promptly so that they don't feel like they're in the dark and alone. So on the flip side, one of the great parts of this is I've now seen the inside of all my students' bedrooms, and I know all their little secrets about their pink walls and their horses. One of my students has an entire wall of horse pictures that I wasn't expecting. So it's I've seen an insight to my students that I haven't seen normally.
Yeah, it's pink walls is definitely that's been interesting. But yeah, so I think it's great that you've been finding these opportunities to check in and finding these like interesting personal touches in remote learning that you might not even get in face to face, like knowing about your students' horse wall. Um, so when you are checking in with your students, what's been the biggest challenge that they've expressed in terms of making this transition?
Faculty going dark. So the number of students, and my daughter had one of these professors as well, where faculty spent the first 2 weeks of the online transition just not posting anything, just not responding, shutting down their Canvas or their Moodle pages till they got it just right, left the students in the dark and made them very anxious. And then the other one is just loading lots of work, posting lots of PowerPoints, putting up lots of problem sets, adding an extra paper, and then not having any contact with the faculty. I heard over and over again from students that faculty weren't responding to emails, faculty weren't posting things. Faculty weren't updating, so that was the number one thing. So I became very conscious of trying to be as available and as present as possible. There were more than I had an 8:30 class, and more than once I said, I'm going to have Canvas chat. If you have any questions, show up. And the first 40 minutes, of course, no one showed up because it's an 8:30 class. And I just sat and had my coffee and read the news. And then when somebody did, I was there. I had a teaching assistant at one point years and years ago who had two teenage daughters, and he told me right off the bat he always had to pick them up from middle school because with middle schoolers you just have to be there the day of the crisis. They don't care if you're there on the good days, they care if you're there on the bad days. And so I sort of adopted that. I just made sure my students knew each week there were several times when I was available if there was a problem. And it was very sweet. I had several students who would just come into the chat to be like, how are you doing? How's your new kitten? I posted pictures of the kitten. I posted funny videos because I found my daughter and my son appreciated that when their teachers did that. So I posted those things. And I know Ashani and RM have seen it, but I posted for my one class the end of Talladega Nights because I said to them, we just have to get across the finish line. It doesn't have to be pretty. And so I posted that, and a lot of students thought that was very funny. The one found it disheartening. I'm sorry about that. It's just the reality of the situation, guys. So, but faculty just removing themselves and one student said, one of their faculty members posted, I like online learning. I'm getting so much research done. Meanwhile, the students were just drowning in work and not sure how to deal with it. So that's not very helpful.
Mhm. Yeah. And then on the flip side of that, what's one thing you feel your students aren't understanding about your predicament right now?
I don't think the students realize how bad most faculty are at LMS and online learning. I think it's just magical that we've all been trained in it and we know what's going on. And so I think for a lot of students, they're surprised when, I had a student, I forgot to open a portal, and the student wrote me this long email. It was very cautious, like, no, 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 I'm just an idiot. I forgot to open the portal. Let me turn it on for you. And then they're very apologetic. I think they really think that faculty really know what they're doing on some of this stuff. And then they get frustrated when it doesn't work, and they're scared to write and say the portal doesn't seem to be open, the video doesn't work, the links aren't connecting, they don't know, and I've had that with both my kids, like, just write the faculty member and tell them it's not working. Oh, they're going to get mad. I'm like, they may not know it's not working. And one of my frustrations is our LMS, even the student view doesn't show me truly what the students see. And so sometimes students send me screenshots of what is showing up. I'm like, oh no, that's not how it's supposed to look. So it can be very frustrating. And I think a big key on the empathy part is creating a relationship where the students feel comfortable letting you know things are a problem, and you feel comfortable asking the students, what would make this easier for you? How can we work together to make this a better process?
Mhm. Great. And then, last theme we've got here, active learning can sometimes be at odds with passive technology. So, pedagogical theories often emphasize the idea of active learning, as we went over in the beginning. However, most ed tech focuses solely on content delivery and assessing for baseline understanding. So, when technology is the only thing connecting you with the student, it can feel like things are kind of going in one ear and out the other. So, to start with, if there was an ideal technology for your course right now, what would it look like?
So I would love something like I said earlier, where I could do peer review or group discussions, and I could hover and watch it and prod it like I do in class when I wander from one to one, without having to set up some system that grades it or tracks it or creates metrics, because not all learning is metrics. There's really very little way outside of the chat feature on ours, though I've worked ways around it, but without, everything asks for a rubric or a grading scheme, and there's very little way to encourage students to get out there and try and make efforts. Having some way to mix technology so students can video or voice in addition to text, um, sort of like this format here, getting things going on several different levels, I think is also important. And having another thing that I fantasize about is having some way for students to be able to mark or insert questions into PowerPoints or recorded lectures so that you know exactly where they got lost, because they're
Mhm.
not good at telling you, oh, well, on slide 4 on this line, so if they could insert and say, I don't understand why this is here, just like we insert comments for them, that would give us a better idea of what's not clear and what is. Because I know when I lecture in front of students, sometimes I circle back to something because I can tell people are talking to each other and not following, and I lose that um, considerably. So those are the things I'd just like to see more interaction.
Mhm. Yeah. So we have this question from Brandon in the chat. Do you think it's better or worse to require students to attend scheduled online lecture times?
So I haven't had to lecture online, though I've done a couple what I would call presentations on resources and stuff. So I've tried two methods, and it's been interesting to see how it happened. I have two sections of the same class. I sent out a PowerPoint with a synchronous lecture over it and asked students to watch that first, and then we'd go over it in class. One class was fine and had lots of questions. The other class said, we want to watch it with you and have you stop it so we can ask questions as we see problems. So I tried to have my students, they were required to do something with me live once a week just so I could set my eyes on them. And a lot of them said that really helped them keep track of the days. Now for the 8:30 class, again, I would open the portal at 8:30 and stay till 9:45, and most of them wouldn't show up till 9:10, and that's okay. But I did find that a lot of them really liked having a schedule, and that too many of their classes were work on this on your own and get it turned in by this time. And that's how my son's school has been going, and that's been very difficult. My daughter's school has had some synchronous issues, and they are going totally synchronous for summer classes and next fall if they're online. They've announced that every class will have a synchronous component, so that tells me that they're aware of the problems. But I had students who thanked me for having a requirement once a week, so they knew when. And I even gave them the option, like half of you need to show up on Tuesday and half need to show up on Thursday. Sign up, commit, and then I'll send it to your calendar, which was a pain. That's another technology I'd like to see. There's no easy way from our system. I have to individually invite all the students if I'm not in taking the whole class.
Mhm.
So, that was a lot of students, a lot of scratch paper and names, but I got it. So,
Mhm. Yeah. Um, and I think there was a comment in here, making that combination of asynchronous and synchronous is definitely a good way to keep your students on some kind of schedule so that they remember what day of the week it is, but so that it's not necessarily a high pressure environment where if their Wi-Fi goes out, that they're completely missing out on a majority of the course components. So
mhm.
giving them that like hybrid of, okay, you have to attend one meeting a week. You have a choice between these two times, and then otherwise, all of your work needs to be done by Friday. Is a good combination of like keeping that schedule, giving them those deadlines, but also not making them feel that it's suddenly inaccessible to them.
Well, and students also underestimate how long it will take to watch a video, how long it will take to listen to a podcast, and then do the assignment on it, and maybe have to listen to the podcast a second time. And I've watched that with my son in one of his classes. My daughter has had to do online learning a lot because of a health issue, and is pretty good at Montessoring herself into any situation. But she has complained that sometimes a teacher would send her a video and say, "Oh, watch this video; that'll catch you up." Say, well, the video is longer than the class was because they'd pull something off YouTube. And part of it is extraneous. And now I've spent an hour and a half watching this video when I could have just read something and taken care of it. So, and I've had students tell me they got behind in a class and had to do a marathon of videos, lecture videos for the class. That is my idea of hell, listening to a talking head for like 5 hours in a row. So, helping them manage the sources is important as well. And thinking about what it's like to be on the other side of this computer is, I think, very important.
Mhm. So we are getting close to the end of time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's hour here. But before we wrap up with just any last minute questions, I do want to ask Carol. So I know that you mentioned that Packback has these like sort of active learning capabilities, and also that real time discussion and real time feedback. So right before we wrap up, do you mind telling us a little bit about how you were using Packback in your fall course to facilitate discussion, and then how you might be using it in this upcoming term as well.
So last fall, I had 110 people in my survey class, and I used the standard pack back. Please ask one question and answer two questions each week. Packpack's very popular with some of my students because they're competitive and they like to see themselves on the leaderboard. But I found it was very helpful because I could figure out what students were getting out of the reading, what questions they were interested in. Packpack let me sort by subject. So I would walk into class with the top Packpack questions that had responses and with the top subjects that there were questions about. So I knew what was sticking and what wasn't. I knew what they were when they were reading, what was occurring to them. I also had a lovely young woman who would come to my office hours on Tuesdays with a list of possible questions she wanted to post to Packback. And that was really helpful because some of her questions were great for discussion. So I would just
Hmm.
tell her I was going to steal them and use them. But it gave me a lot of feedback. It gets my students writing every single week too. And while they will say to me, well, you can game it. If you put examples in and complete sentences, you get a better score. I don't think that's gaming it. I think that's actually writing well. But it does give them the best way to become a better writer is to write all the time. And it also, I had a couple of discussions that went 20 or 30 responses, and people went back and forth and dug up more information. And back to the very first question about, well, why have online learning if students can figure it out for themselves? I applaud it when my students take the time to go find another article to refute what somebody said. That's what we should be striving for, right? Isn't that what employers want too? People who can problem solve and find their own information. So I love it when my TA would say to me, "Oh my gosh, we've got a live one going. Go look at this discussion." And I'd see people pulling from different resources and putting up Khan Academy videos like, no, 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 here's what they say about the Constitution. So, I think the more they talk about history outside of class, the more I win. So,
Hmm. So I know that right before we got on this webinar, you were discussing that UNC Charlotte is thinking about going back in person for the fall. So in case if they for some reason revert that decision and are thinking of being online, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you think the benefits of Packback might be when your students are going to spend another semester remote.
so I'm planning as if we will go online at some point for next fall. That's just where I think we're going to be at. And I think Packback will be helpful providing me insight into what's going on in students' heads and their minds, and will help them get connections between each other when they're off campus and online learning. The number of students who've told me they're lonely is always interesting to me. The fact that they'll admit that to a professor says a lot. But I think Packback would help with that because it is a discussion and it is a way for people to get to know each other. And last fall, I was surprised how many students knew each other's names and then were search because they all make their little avatars. Then they were trying to search the class for who that person really was because they don't look like their avatar. So I think it just provides a sense of community that's been hard to recreate in through these normal through the current LMSs and channels. And my class last fall was incredibly active on Packback, and lots of people participated. And I had a Packback facilitator that I'd drawn from a previous class, and he did a fantastic job encouraging students and coaching them. But it just gives you a chance to give more feedback, but it does give the students a chance to have a connection that they might not have otherwise.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, and I've seen that there are a couple of the chat is very robust today, which is always great to see. But um, Alicia just said, I'm preparing for fully online and preparing over the summer because by the time my university announces, I don't think we'll have enough time to do a good job,
Amen,
which is kind
Alicia.
of mirroring, yeah, mirroring what you're saying there of you're going to prepare as if you will be online. So before we wrap up here real quick, this is part of a larger webinar series that we are doing here at Packback. So I want to take some time to thank Carol so much. You are such an empathetic professor and you genuinely care so much about your students. And we can really all see that here, which is really just amazing. I'm so glad that there are instructors like you out there. And I just have really enjoyed this conversation. But if you are interested in participating more in this Packback webinar series, our webinar next week is going to be about what you can be doing now to prepare students for a post-COVID economy. So we're going to have a professor from Texas State in the business department and a couple of others as well. So it should be really, really interesting. But I think for the folks that are here today, we do have a webinar in 2 weeks on Tuesday, May 19th, which is going to be all about how do you make a resilient digital ready syllabus as if your syllabus could be in person or online. So stay tuned. Our website is packback.co/webinars, where you can get all the information about these upcoming webinars, but we would love to see you there. But yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Alicia, I will see you at the syllabus webinar. But yeah, any last questions or comments before we get on to our day?
Very busy.
Yes. All right. Well, in case if you do have any additional questions, I will go ahead to. So Carol's contact information is here. So in case if you ever want to speak to her about any of her tips and tricks for being empathetic and learning more about her approach to online learning. And then if you do have interest in seeing a demo of Packback, please email curious@packback.co or go to packback.co/demo. Both of those will get you to the right spot. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. This was amazing to see you all. Love to see that the chat was really robust and lots of tips being shared there. But otherwise, we hope to be in touch soon and see you at a future webinar.
Thank you, Shani and Ariam, and the rest of the Packback team.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Here. Bye. Wash your hands.